Los Angeles, 1947. The city was alive with light and movement, pulsing with the rhythm of new beginnings. Streetcars rolled down wide boulevards, their bells echoing between palm-lined streets. Hollywood glittered on the horizon, a place where dreams shimmered just out of reach. War was over, hope was returning, and everyone, it seemed, was looking for a fresh start. But in every city of light, there are shadows. And sometimes, those shadows tell stories the daylight can't bear to face. It was a cool January morning in the Limert Park district. Quiet, unremarkable, just another piece of Los Angeles waking up. A young mother, walking her baby stroller down the sidewalk, stopped for a moment. Something on the edge of a vacant lot caught her eye, something pale against the dark grass. At first, she thought it was a mannequin, maybe a discarded store display, left behind after the holidays. But as she stepped closer, a chill crept through her. The figure wasn't plastic. It wasn't lifeless in the way mannequins are. It was still, terribly still, but it was real. She gasped, clutching her baby to her chest, and ran to the nearest house for help. Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood filled with sirens, flashing lights, and footsteps crunching across the cold ground. Detectives cordoned off the area. Reporters arrived breathless, and the crowd began to form. What they found would become one of the most haunting cases in American history. There, in the vacant lot, lay the body of a young woman. She had been arranged with unsettling precision, as if her killer wanted the world to see her, to remember her. There was no blood at the scene, no sign of struggle, just stillness, and the feeling that whoever had done this wanted it to be discovered. Her name was not yet known, but the image, pale, poised, and tragic, spread across Los Angeles within hours. Reporters swarmed the police station, demanding details. The newspapers gave her a name that would echo through decades, the Black Dahlia. They said she loved to wear black, that her hair was dark, her lipstick bright red. They said she had a mysterious beauty, like something out of a film noir. The name fit too well, and the myth began to grow. Her real name was Elizabeth Short, 22 years old. Born in Boston, raised in a modest family, one of 5 daughters. Those who knew her described her as quiet, polite, with a soft laugh and a love for the movies. She came to California like so many others, searching for her place in the sun. She dreamed of acting, of seeing her name in lights, but the city could be cruel to dreamers, especially those who had no one to protect them. Detectives soon learned that Elizabeth had been living a transient life, staying in cheap hotels, visiting friends, often without a steady job or home. She was charming, independent, sometimes secretive. She had admirers, men who promised her everything and delivered little. But she never stopped hoping for her big break. As police began to piece together her final days, the puzzle grew more complex. There were countless stories, some true, many fabricated, about where she had been, who she had met, what she had said. The press turned her into a character, painting her as both innocent and scandalous, saint and sinner. But beneath the headlines, she was simply human, a young woman navigating a city that promised so much and gave so little. The investigation quickly became a media circus. Every whisper, every rumor became front-page news. Detectives followed hundreds of leads, interviewed dozens of suspects, and chased stories that led nowhere. Every day, the city buzzed with new theories. Every night, people locked their doors a little earlier. And yet, despite all the noise, one truth remained. Someone had ended Elizabeth's life in a way so deliberate, so cruel, it could only have come from darkness hidden behind a mask of fascination. In the city of angels, beauty and tragedy had met, and the story of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, would become a legend that Los Angeles could never quite forget. Even now, when the city grows quiet and the neon signs hum softly in the distance, her name drifts through the night air like a ghost, a whisper of innocence lost, of dreams turned to dust, and of mysteries that refuse to fade. Before the headlines, before the photographs, before the nickname that would follow her into eternity, there was simply a young woman named Elizabeth Short. She was born on a cold July day in 1924 in Boston, Massachusetts. the third of 5 daughters to Cleo and Phoebe Short. Her early years were marked by simplicity, by family dinners, by the kind of small joys that filled ordinary American homes in the years before the Great Depression. But when the economy collapsed, so did her family's sense of security. Her father's small business failed. One morning, his car was found abandoned on a bridge, and for years, everyone believed he had taken his own life. Elizabeth was just 6. Her mother, Phoebe, did what she could to raise 5 girls alone, working multiple jobs, holding the family together with quiet strength and endless love. Years later, the truth would surface. Her father was alive, living in California. He had simply walked away from the life he had built. For Elizabeth, that revelation carried a kind of quiet wound, the kind that never fully heals but becomes a shadow you learn to live beside. As she grew, Elizabeth's beauty began to draw attention. She had fair skin, striking blue eyes, and dark hair that framed her face like ink against paper. She loved dressing up, curling her hair, and wearing flowers or ribbons that made her feel elegant. But what stood out most wasn't her appearance. It was her presence. Friends said she carried herself with grace, with a soft, dreamy confidence, as if she belonged in a world slightly removed from the one around her. She adored movies. Hollywood, to her, wasn't just a place. It was an idea, a shining promise that even the forgotten could be seen, that ordinary people could become extraordinary. When she watched films, she didn't just see actors, she saw possibilities. And so, like countless others, she dreamed of California. Her teenage years were restless. She spent time in Florida, in Massachusetts, and later in California, often moving to escape the cold, to chase warmth. Not just the weather, but the feeling of belonging. She suffered from chronic asthma, and doctors once suggested that warmer climates might help. So she went west, drawn by the sun and the hope of healing. Those who met her described her as polite, soft-spoken, and endlessly kind. She had a way of making others feel at ease, of smiling even when things were difficult. But she also carried a quiet sadness, a sense of distance, as if she was always half lost in thought. She wrote letters to friends back home, often describing small moments. A new dress she'd bought, a movie she'd seen, or the way the California sky looked at night. Elizabeth lived simply. She worked in diners, stayed with friends, and relied on kindness where she could find it. Money was often tight. She didn't have the security or support that many others did, but she never let go of the dream, the belief that one day, something good would come her way. She loved conversation, laughter, and people who made her feel alive. Many men were drawn to her. Her beauty, her mystery, her openness. But Elizabeth wasn't the flirtatious socialite that newspapers later painted her to be. She was trusting, sometimes too trusting. She wanted to believe in love, in friendship, in people's better nature. At night, she often wandered the city with friends, exploring cafes and movie theaters, sharing stories about the future. She spoke about becoming an actress, not necessarily a star, but someone who could be remembered, someone who could leave a mark. And in a way, she did, though not in the way she imagined. The world would later reduce her to headlines, to mystery, to myth. But before all that, Elizabeth Short was simply a young woman searching for light, gentle, hopeful, and full of quiet resilience. She wasn't the Black Dahlia. She was Beth, a daughter, a friend, a dreamer, someone who wrote letters, told jokes, and believed that happiness might be waiting just around the next corner. If you close your eyes and listen closely, you can almost imagine her walking down a California street, the hum of cars, the warmth of the sun, her laughter blending with the noise of the city. For a brief moment, before the darkness came, she was exactly where she wanted to be, alive, young, and full of possibility. It was the morning of January 15th, 1947, when Los Angeles awoke to something it had never seen before. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the city in soft gray light. For most, it was an ordinary Wednesday. But for one woman, out walking with her baby in a quiet neighborhood of Leimert Park, it would become a moment she would never forget. The street was still, the air cool and faintly damp from the night before. Across the way, In a vacant lot surrounded by weeds and small patches of dirt, something pale caught her attention. It looked almost like porcelain, smooth, white, motionless. She slowed her steps, squinting through the morning haze. At first, she thought it was a mannequin, cut cleanly in half, perhaps discarded after a store's display had been taken down. But something about it didn't feel right. The stillness was too real, the color too human. A shiver ran through her, and she turned away, clutching her baby close as she hurried to call the police. Within minutes, patrol cars arrived. Sirens cut through the calm air, their sound bouncing off the houses like echoes of something far away. Detectives stepped out, their shoes crunching on gravel, eyes narrowing as they approached the scene. What they saw left even the most hardened among them silent. It was clear this wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Whoever had done this had taken their time. The body of a young woman lay in the grass, arranged carefully, almost ritualistically. The ground around her was untouched. No footprints, no sign of struggle, no blood. It was as if she had been placed there, in that open field, for someone to find. Detectives noted the strange precision of what they were seeing. The work, they said, appeared to be that of someone with surgical knowledge, someone who understood anatomy. They combed the area, marking every detail, every fragment of evidence. But there was almost nothing. Just a single heel print in the soil, a tire track on the curb, and a handbag half buried nearby. By noon, the press had already arrived. Word spread fast. A gruesome discovery in South Los Angeles. Journalists pushed against police tape, snapping photographs, scribbling in notebooks. In the following hours, her photograph would make its way onto front pages across the city. Soon, the name the Black Dahlia appeared in headlines, a name that would become one of the most haunting in true crime history. At the downtown police station, detectives worked tirelessly to identify her. Fingerprints were taken and sent to the FBI. Within a day, a match came through. Elizabeth Short, 22 years old, recently seen in the downtown Biltmore Hotel. Her last confirmed sighting was just a few days before her body was found. The investigation became one of the largest in Los Angeles history. Hundreds of officers were assigned to the case. Every detail of Elizabeth's life was scrutinized. Detectives tracked her last days through cafes, bus stops, and apartments. She had been seen meeting a man, though his name was never confirmed. Rumors spread quickly. Some said she was involved with powerful men. Others claimed she was part of something darker. But most of it was speculation, fed by the hunger of the press. The LAPD received letters. Strange, taunting notes sent to newspapers and detectives. Some signed the Black Dahlia Avenger. One even included personal items belonging to Elizabeth, her birth certificate, photographs, and an address book. The envelope had been carefully wiped clean, every fingerprint removed. Whoever sent it wanted attention and control. But for all their leads, detectives had no answers. Every promising suspect seemed to fade into uncertainty. Doctors, soldiers, actors, and drifters. All questioned, all released. Evidence slipped through their hands like smoke. Weeks turned into months. The headlines grew colder. The public's fascination remained. But the truth stayed hidden beneath layers of rumor and myth. Each clue led to another dead end. Each suspect was followed by another theory. The deeper investigators dug, the murkier everything became. And so, slowly, the case began to drift, from fact into legend. Elizabeth's story became less about who she was, and more about what she represented. Innocence, beauty, and the darkness that lurks behind both. Detectives kept her photograph on their desks for years. Some retired still haunted by her case, wondering if they had missed something. Even now, decades later, when Los Angeles is quiet and the streets glimmer under streetlights, some say her story still lingers. In the archives of the LAPD, in the fading photographs, in the silence of an unsolved mystery, the presence of Elizabeth Short remains. The case of the Black Dahlia became more than a crime. It became a reflection of obsession, of fame, and of how quickly a human life can be transformed into a symbol. And behind it all was a young woman who once smiled, once dreamed, and once believed that life still held something beautiful for her. As the weeks turned into months, the mystery of Elizabeth Short began to spread far beyond Los Angeles. Detectives worked tirelessly, chasing down every lead, yet each one seemed to dissolve as soon as it appeared. Still, the city buzzed with rumors. Whispers filled cafes, barber shops, and newspaper stands, each person convinced they knew who had done it. The name Black Dahlia had become something larger than the woman herself, a haunting symbol of beauty and tragedy interwoven. The first real suspect came early, a man named Robert "Red" Manley, a traveling salesman. He had been one of the last to see Elizabeth alive. Red had driven her to the Biltmore Hotel, where she said she was meeting someone. He described her as calm, polite, and hopeful. She'd mentioned getting a letter soon, perhaps about a job. Manley cooperated fully, passed 2 lie detector tests, and was released. He had nothing to hide, only a lingering sadness about being the last person to see her before she disappeared into the city's neon glow. Then came the letters. Days after her body was found, newspapers began receiving envelopes. Some typed, others handwritten, all signed by a mysterious figure who called himself the Black Dahlia Avenger. One letter promised to turn himself in. Another included personal belongings, her ID, her birth certificate, and photos carefully wrapped in paper. Everything had been cleaned, scrubbed of fingerprints, as though the sender wanted to show how close he had been and how far he remained from being caught. The letters gave detectives hope, then despair. Whoever wrote them was clever. He seemed to understand how to keep the city captive with fear. Soon, more suspects emerged. Over the years, there would be more than 150 of them. From jealous lovers and jilted suitors to doctors, drifters, and even Hollywood insiders. But one name has echoed louder than the rest: Dr. George Hodel. Hodel was a wealthy physician, brilliant but strange. He lived in a striking, modern mansion in the Hollywood Hills, the Soden House, a place whose architecture seemed as mysterious as the man himself. He was known for his connections, his parties, and his unusual taste in art and company. When detectives investigated him years later, they found his past filled with troubling stories, allegations, strange recordings, and a trail of secrets that made even seasoned investigators uneasy. In the 1940s, Dr. Hodel had been under police surveillance. Hidden microphones were placed in his home. The recordings captured eerie fragments of conversation. One where Hodel seemed to mock the investigators, and another where he said, almost to himself, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now." The line sent chills down the spines of those who heard it, though even that was never enough for a conviction. Afterward, Hodel left the country. He lived for years overseas, only returning to the U.S. much later, never charged with any crime. To this day, his name remains one of the strongest, yet unproven, links to Elizabeth's death. But there were others, too. Some believed Elizabeth had crossed paths with someone in the film industry, a man drawn to her beauty, perhaps envious of her innocence. Others thought she might have trusted someone who promised opportunity and instead led her to her fate. Detectives explored every possibility: a jealous woman, a criminal drifter, even a police officer. Each theory carried its own truth and its own flaws. Years passed, and as each lead faded, the case turned cold. The physical evidence, the letters, the fingerprints, the items from the crime scene, all stored carefully in boxes that gathered dust in a police archive. As detectives retired, new ones would take up the case, reopening files, hoping that with time and technology, something new might appear. But even DNA, decades later, offered only silence. Still, the theories endure, like faint echoes across the city. Some say Hodel was guilty, that his surgical skill and arrogance fit the crime perfectly. Others claim the Black Dahlia was one of several victims of a serial killer who moved through post-war Los Angeles unnoticed. And some believe the truth has long been known, quietly buried to protect powerful people. But perhaps the truest part of this story is the mystery itself, a case that refuses to rest. a life that continues to stir the imagination of all who hear her name. Elizabeth Short remains suspended in time, her story retold again and again, each version a little different, each one searching for an answer that never seems to come. And maybe that's what keeps her memory alive, because in a city built on illusion, she became the most enduring mystery of them all, a reminder of beauty, loss, and the shadows that linger just beneath the light. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories. What once shook a city now drifts like a whisper in its endless hum. Los Angeles has changed. The streets are louder, the lights brighter. Yet somewhere in its quiet corners, the story of Elizabeth Short still lingers. For many, she became more myth than person. Newspapers painted her as the Black Dahlia, a mysterious beauty, a Hollywood dreamer whose life ended in tragedy. But behind the nickname was simply Elizabeth, a young woman from Massachusetts who loved movies, laughter, and the idea that something wonderful might still be waiting for her. In her letters home, she wrote about acting, about warm California nights, about how she believed that if she just stayed patient, things might finally turn her way. She never knew that those words would outlive her, carried through decades by people who never met her. After her death, the city became obsessed. Detectives followed rumors. Journalists crafted stories that blurred fact with fiction. Everyone wanted an answer, a villain, a resolution, something to make sense of what had happened. But no one found it. And as the years went on, the silence around her case became part of its mystery. By the 1950s, the name Black Dahlia had already become a symbol of Hollywood's darker side, of beauty consumed by ambition, and of the strange fascination humans have with tragedy. Writers, filmmakers, and artists all tried to capture her story, each turning her into something new. A femme fatale, a lost soul, a cautionary tale. Yet none of those portrayals truly captured her, because the truth was quieter, simpler, and infinitely sadder. Elizabeth Short wasn't famous. She was simply young, hopeful, and alone in a city that promised dreams but often delivered shadows. Even so, her story has never disappeared. It exists in countless books, podcasts, and documentaries. It's taught in criminology classes, debated in forums, whispered about by night owls scrolling through mysteries before bed. Each generation rediscovers her, drawn not only by the horror of her death, but by the haunting question of who she was before it. In Los Angeles, the field where she was found is gone now. Paved over, replaced by homes, fences, and sidewalks. People drive by without realizing the history beneath their tires. The city has built itself over her story, layer by layer, yet something intangible still seems to rest there. A strange, lingering stillness that those who know the story can almost feel. Detectives who worked the case are long gone. Their notes and photographs sit in archives, locked away from the public eye. Some of their children have spoken of how their fathers were never the same afterward, how they kept files by their bedsides, convinced that one day something would click. But it never did. The mystery remained unbroken, and perhaps that's why it endures. Because sometimes the unsolved becomes timeless. It transforms from a story of justice denied into one of remembrance. A way for us to reflect on how fragile life is, how quickly it can be taken, and how much meaning a single story can hold. In the years since, many have tried to reclaim Elizabeth's image. Writers have spoken her name softly again, separating her from the myth that consumed her. They've described her as kind, insecure, sensitive, a woman who smiled even when she felt small. And in those retellings, something shifts. The story no longer belongs to the tabloids or the killers or the endless speculation. It becomes hers again. At night, when the city quiets, you can almost imagine her walking through old Los Angeles, past dim neon signs, beneath the soft hum of streetlights, her hair glinting under the glow. The air would be warm, the stars distant. Somewhere, a radio would be playing faintly through an open window, the kind of old Hollywood song that feels like it belongs to another lifetime. And maybe, in that imagined version, she smiles. Because in memory, she is no longer broken. She simply drifts, eternal, untouched by the years that followed. Elizabeth's short story is not just about her death. It's about how we remember the lost, how we search for meaning in silence, and how even the most tragic stories can remind us of the beauty and brevity of life. So tonight, as the city sleeps, remember her not as a headline, but as a person. A daughter, a dreamer, and a woman who wanted to belong. And as you drift off, think of her not in darkness, but in light, walking beneath a California sky that, even after all this time, still holds her story somewhere among its stars. Elizabeth Short's story lingers long after the headlines fade. She was not just a name, not just a myth. She was a young woman with dreams, with hope, with quiet resilience. Her life was ordinary in so many ways, yet it became extraordinary in tragedy, leaving behind questions that remain unanswered even today. As we remember her softly and gently, we honor the person behind the story. Her name, her letters, her dreams, all whisper to us from the past, reminding us of life's fragility and the shadows that sometimes lie hidden beneath beauty and ambition. Stories like Elizabeth's endure because they teach us to look closer, to notice the humanity in each life, and to reflect on what it means to live, to hope, and to be remembered. Even in mystery, there is meaning. Even in darkness, there is a quiet light. If this story held your attention, subscribe to drift into more softly told true crime tales. Stories that honor the lives behind the headlines, told calmly, with care, and meant to be listened to as you settle into sleep. Remember her, not for the tragedy, but for the life she lived, and the quiet legacy that still moves through time. Story 2. It was Christmas morning, December 25th, 1996, in Boulder, Colorado. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the faint scent of pine and snow. The streets were quiet, blanketed in white, and the sunlight reflected softly off frosted rooftops. It was the kind of morning that felt timeless, perfect for families to wake slowly, savoring the calm before the day's festivities. Inside a large, brick home on a peaceful suburban street, the Ramsey family stirred. The house was decorated with twinkling lights and garlands. The scent of fresh cookies lingered in the kitchen, and neatly wrapped presents lined the living room floor. It was a scene that could have belonged in a storybook, warm, cheerful, and orderly. The kind of place where memories are made, laughter shared, and childhood innocence celebrated. But that morning held an unease, subtle at first, like the pause in a note just before a song begins. JonBenet Ramsey, a 6-year-old girl with wide eyes and a curious smile, had not been seen that morning. Her absence, at first unnoticed amid the excitement of the holiday, soon became a quiet concern. Her parents, John and Patsy, called for her gently, their voices threading through the halls. No response came. Minutes felt longer than usual. The house, once filled with warmth, seemed to hold its breath. It was then that Patsy noticed something on the staircase. A folded note, carefully placed, its paper crisp and unervingly deliberate. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the words measured, each sentence seeming both precise and impossible to ignore. It spoke of a demand, instructions to follow, a warning to obey, but in a tone that was strangely calm, almost conversational, despite the fear it could inspire. John read it quietly, then aloud, his voice low, steady, yet tinged with disbelief. The words seemed unreal, out of place in a home so ordinary, on a morning so sacred. Neighbors passing by might have seen nothing unusual. To them, it was just another winter morning. But inside that home, the rhythm of a family Christmas had been broken, replaced by uncertainty and dread. Soon, the phone calls began. The police were alerted. Officers arrived quickly, stepping into the house with careful, practiced motions. They moved slowly, their eyes scanning, ears attuned to the faintest noise. Every room was examined, each corner scrutinized. A quiet tension filled the air, unlike the usual bustling energy of holiday preparations. As investigators worked, the full weight of the situation became clearer. JonBenet, a child who had spent her days singing softly, playing quietly, and exploring the world with a gentle curiosity, had disappeared within the walls of her own home. The house, which moments ago had been a sanctuary of family life, now felt strangely hollow. Every gift, every decoration, every ornament seemed to hold a question, a silent witness to the unfolding mystery. Outside, the snow continued to fall. It muffled sound, softened edges, and created a quiet world where movement and noise seemed distant, almost dreamlike. Inside, however, the tension was palpable, stretching the hours into something heavier than usual, the kind of weight that lingers in memory. Neighbors began to gather quietly, their voices hushed, exchanging concerned glances. The story, initially whispered, would soon travel far beyond the streets of Boulder. By the afternoon, journalists arrived, cameras quietly clicking, microphones hovering like unseen observers. The case, though still in its earliest moments, had already begun to attract attention, curiosity, and speculation. Yet, beneath all the questions and the fear, there remained JonBenet herself, a 6-year-old child, full of life, who had once run through this house with laughter, untroubled by the world's complexity. In this moment, the story of her disappearance was not yet sensationalized. It was not yet headlines or speculation. It was simply the quiet, urgent concern of a family searching for a child. And in that still, snow-covered morning, the city of Boulder held its breath. Every footstep, every whisper, every shadow seemed to echo with uncertainty. The world would soon know her name, JonBenet Ramsey. But before it did, there was only the quiet tension of a Christmas morning interrupted, a house filled with unanswered questions, and the faint, lingering hope that everything would somehow be all right. As the sun rose higher in the winter sky, the peacefulness outside remained. Inside, hearts raced, thoughts spun, and the rhythm of family life had been replaced by something heavier, something that would not leave for decades. This was the beginning of a story that would captivate a nation, puzzle investigators, and haunt the memories of those who never forgot the image of a little girl whose life was full of promise, yet shadowed by tragedy. Before headlines, before the tragedy, before the world's fascination transformed her into a symbol, there was simply JonBenet Patricia Ramsey, a 6-year-old girl with sparkling eyes, a ready smile, and the kind of curiosity that belongs only to children. Born on August 6, 1990, in Atlanta, Georgia, JonBenet was the youngest daughter of John and Patsy Ramsey. From the very beginning, she carried a quiet brightness, a gentle charm that drew people to her. Her older brother, Burke, often remembered her as playful, lively, yet with a sense of awareness unusual for her age. She loved music, dancing, and the simple pleasures of childhood. The warmth of a parent's embrace, the thrill of opening presents, and the quiet wonder of snowy winter mornings. Her family moved to Boulder, Colorado, when she was very young, seeking a life filled with promise and comfort. The Ramseys' home was warm, tidy, and filled with love. JonBenet's parents encouraged her curiosity, guided her play, and nurtured her imagination. She delighted in stories, fairy tales, and the idea of magic that seemed to float in the quiet corners of her home. To her, the world was full of possibilities, a place where laughter mattered, kindness mattered, and dreams could feel tangible, even if just for a moment. JonBenet's involvement in child beauty pageants was a small, yet significant part of her life. These competitions fascinated her not because of attention or fame, but because she loved the costumes, the gentle applause, and the feeling of performing something she had practiced and perfected. She took pride in her appearance, not with vanity, but with a natural joy, a child's delight in dressing up and presenting herself to the world. Her parents guided her carefully, attending events, helping her rehearse lines, and ensuring that she remained grounded despite the excitement of the pageant world. At school, JonBenet was bright and curious. She asked questions, remembered small details, and delighted in simple discoveries. A new drawing, a freshly fallen snowflake, a bird perched outside the window. Her teachers described her as polite, attentive, and eager to learn. She had friends, though her small world was still largely defined by the comfort and security of her home. She loved being with her family, sharing stories with her brother, and exploring the world of imagination that every child inhabits. Despite her apparent happiness, JonBenet was not untouched by the quiet struggles of family life. She had moments of shyness, of uncertainty, and the subtle anxieties that sometimes accompany children growing up in households with high expectations. Yet she carried these moments lightly, balancing them with laughter, playfulness, and the natural resilience of childhood. Her life, although brief, was filled with ordinary wonders: trips to the park, quiet mornings of story time, and the sparkle of Christmas mornings, where wrapped presents promised delight and surprise. It was the simple joy of being a child, the soft hum of music, the warmth of loved ones, the small victories and discoveries that fill a young life with meaning. JonBenet was more than her pageant titles, more than the headlines that would later carry her name. She was a daughter who smiled easily, a sister who giggled with her brother, and a child who cherished moments of simple happiness. Her world, though it seemed secure and full of love, would soon be upended by forces no child should ever face. Even as the story of her death captured national attention, JonBenet's life was far more than a mystery to solve. She was real, vivid, and human. A little girl with dreams, fears, and laughter that once echoed through the halls of her home. Her life reminds us of the fragility of innocence, the preciousness of childhood, and the deep resonance of memory long after a life has been cut tragically short. As we reflect on her story, it is essential to hold that image softly. JonBenet playing in the snow, twirling in a pageant dress, whispering a secret to her brother, or smiling at her parents. These moments, small and quiet, are the essence of who she was. Not the speculation, not the headlines, not the questions that would later follow. She was a child first and always, and in remembering her, gently, we honor the life she lived, the joy she brought, and the quiet hope she carried in her small heart. Even decades later, that image remains vivid, a reminder of the human being behind the story, the warmth of her laughter, and the light she brought into the world for the short time she was here. It was a quiet morning in Boulder, Colorado, on December 25th, 1996. Outside, snow blanketed the streets, muffling the usual sounds of a waking neighborhood. Inside the Ramsey home, the house was still, decorated with the soft glow of Christmas lights. The smell of cinnamon and fresh pine lingered in the air. It should have been a morning of laughter, of children opening gifts and families sharing quiet moments. But something was not right. JonBenet Ramsey, 6 years old, was missing. Her parents, John and Patsy, called her name gently at first, their voices threading through the halls. When no response came, concern began to settle in, subtle at first, like the shift in air before a winter storm. Then Patsy noticed something unusual at the bottom of the stairs. A folded piece of paper, carefully placed, its edges crisp and deliberate. The note was strange. It was long, written in a neat, almost formal hand. It claimed that JonBenet had been taken, that her safety depended on the instructions to follow. It spoke of a ransom, but in a tone that was unsettlingly calm, almost conversational, yet impossible to ignore. The words left a sense of unease, like a shadow stretching across a room filled with sunlight. John read the note quietly, then aloud, his voice low, measured, yet trembling just slightly with disbelief. The words seemed unreal, impossible in the warmth and familiarity of their home. Neighbors, if they had known, would have seen nothing unusual beyond the soft morning snow. But inside the house, tension had begun to build, unspoken and heavy. Within minutes, the police were called. Officers arrived, their steps quiet against the snow-dusted walkways, eyes alert, ears attuned to every sound. They entered the home carefully, scanning each room, checking closets, and observing every detail. The once cheerful house, filled with the promise of Christmas, felt suddenly strange, quiet in a way that made every corner seem significant. Hours passed as the investigation began. Detectives examined every inch of the home, piecing together the timeline of the previous night, speaking softly with the parents, and noting small details that might later prove important. The phone had rung, a neighbor had noticed something odd, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the day. Snow continued to fall outside, thickening the sense of quiet, isolating the home from the world beyond. Then, later that morning, JonBenét's body was discovered in the basement. The revelation brought a heavy stillness over the house, a silence so deep it seemed to press against the walls. Officers moved methodically, documenting the scene with care. It was a home, yet suddenly it was also a crime scene, a place of questions and sorrow. The media quickly became aware of the case. Reporters arrived, cameras set up outside the home, and the story began to spread. Yet even as the public learned her name, JonBenet Ramsey, the details remained uncertain. Detectives worked tirelessly, tracking every lead, every piece of evidence, and every observation that might reveal what had happened. The note, the discovery, and the home itself all became part of the investigation. Investigators carefully collected evidence, preserving it for forensic analysis. They documented handwriting, the placement of objects, the smallest footprints, the faintest traces of movement. Everything mattered, every detail potentially critical, every observation weighed carefully. Families and neighbors watched quietly, some with disbelief, some with sorrow, all sensing that something extraordinary had occurred in what had seemed like an ordinary neighborhood. The story spread slowly at first, whispers moving through the streets, until it became clear that this case would capture national attention. Despite the tragedy, there remained a focus on the human side of the story. JonBenet was a child, small, vibrant, full of potential, and loved deeply by her family. Detectives and officers approached the investigation with both professionalism and a sense of reverence, aware that the child at the center of this mystery deserved respect and care. The initial investigation set the stage for a story that would span decades. Leads came and went. Suspects were questioned. Clues were examined meticulously, some providing hope, others frustration. The world began to notice, and the story of JonBenet Ramsey, a child whose life was filled with light and curiosity, was transformed into a mystery that would endure for years. Even today, the events of that Christmas morning remain vivid in memory. The quiet streets, the falling snow, the glow of lights on the tree, all hold traces of a day that should have been ordinary, yet became extraordinary in sorrow. The discovery of JonBenet's life cut short is a reminder of the fragility of childhood and the importance of remembering the person behind the headlines. And so, the investigation continued, meticulous, careful, and profoundly human, as the city of Boulder held its breath and the world listened, waiting for answers that remained just out of reach. After the discovery of JonBenet Ramsey, Boulder, Colorado, became a place where whispers filled the quiet streets and questions hung in the crisp winter air. The case captivated the nation, and people everywhere wanted answers. Who could have harmed such a young child? How could it have happened in a home so familiar, so safe? Investigators worked tirelessly. From the very beginning, attention fell on JonBenet's own family. Her parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, were scrutinized under bright lights of suspicion. Detectives interviewed them carefully, listening to their recollections, noting every word and every pause. Neighbors and friends offered statements, some describing unusual behavior, others insisting that the family seemed ordinary, loving, and devoted. For months, every detail was examined, the parents' schedules, their interactions, and even the relationships within the household. Yet, despite intense investigation, no charges were ever filed, and the Ramsey family maintained their innocence, quietly living with the public scrutiny that followed. As the case unfolded, attention turned to the idea of an intruder, someone unknown to the family. Some believed an opportunistic criminal could have entered the home, hidden, or forced their way in. Signs of entry were debated, footprints and fingerprints analyzed, and every theory weighed with care. Detectives explored multiple possibilities, carefully considering who might have been in the neighborhood, who had opportunity, and who might have motive. Meanwhile, Letters and notes played a role in shaping public and investigative opinion. The ransom note, long and detailed, became a critical piece of evidence, yet also a source of speculation. Was it written by someone inside the home, or an outside party trying to mislead investigators? Every detail was studied: handwriting, word choice, and the time it might have taken to write it. Even today, the note remains one of the most perplexing elements of the case. Over the years, hundreds of people became persons of interest. Some were acquaintances, some strangers, and some merely passing through. Investigators questioned neighbors, delivery men, and visitors, anyone who could provide insight into the night of December 24th and 25th. Each lead was followed, but most ended in frustration. Some offered tantalizing possibilities. Others provided nothing at all. The media amplified every detail. Newspapers, television, and later documentaries examined every aspect of JonBenét's life and her home, turning the case into a national conversation. Speculation ran wild. Theories about family involvement, intruders, or someone obsessed with the child circulated endlessly. Yet amid all the attention, the truth remained elusive. Experts weighed in, analyzing psychological profiles, patterns of behavior, and criminal tendencies. Some suggested that a stranger with specific knowledge of the home might have been responsible. Others focused on the family dynamics, searching for hidden motives. Some theories were methodical, others less so, yet all contributed to a growing web of questions that seemed impossible to untangle. Despite the scrutiny, the case remained officially unsolved. Investigators continued to follow leads over the years, reviewing old evidence and considering advances in technology that might finally provide answers. The DNA samples preserved, the photographs carefully archived, and the files meticulously maintained all held the potential to unlock new understanding. Yet the case's complexity, combined with conflicting theories and public pressure, meant that certainty was always just out of reach. Even today, JonBenét's story inspires fascination and reflection. The names of suspects and theories have faded in memory for some, but the essence of the mystery remains. People continue to ask, how could such a tragedy happen in a home meant for safety? How could a child so loved vanish from the warmth of her family's embrace? Perhaps the most lasting aspect of the case is the reminder it offers. A young life, full of potential, was lost in a world that can be both ordinary and unpredictable. The details of suspects and theories are complex, but behind them is a child who deserves to be remembered not for speculation, but for who she was. JonBenet, a little girl with curiosity, joy, and laughter. The story continues to unfold in memory, in documentaries, in discussions, and in the quiet hearts of those who reflect on it. It is a tale of uncertainty, of unanswered questions, and of the profound impact that one young life can have on a community and a nation. And though theories may change and suspects may come and go in public conversation, the reality remains. JonBenét's life, brief and luminous, continues to resonate decades later. As the city of Boulder moved on, the case stayed with investigators, journalists, and the public alike. Every new development, every review of evidence was met with hope. Hope for clarity, hope for understanding, hope that the little girl at the center of it all might finally be honored for who she was, rather than the mystery that surrounded her death. Time moved quietly, even in the face of tragedy. The streets of Boulder, Colorado, continue to shimmer under snowfall in winter, the hum of summer days, and the gentle rustle of autumn leaves. Yet, for those who remember, the story of JonBenet Ramsey remains, a soft echo of innocence and the fragility of life. JonBenet was more than a headline, more than a mystery, more than a question mark that captivated a nation. She was a 6-year-old child, curious, playful, and full of wonder. She loved music, dancing, stories, and the quiet joy of being a little girl with her family nearby. Her laughter, her smile, and her small achievements. Opening gifts, twirling in a pageant dress, sharing a secret with her brother, are the moments that truly define her. They are the images to hold close, far more than speculation or theories that follow her name. Her story, as tragic as it is, reminds us of the importance of memory and empathy. The world may never know the full truth of what happened on that December morning, but we can remember her life with care. We can honor her, not by sensationalizing the mystery, but by holding onto the quiet light she carried in her short years. Over time, the case has influenced more than just investigative techniques. It has shaped how we consider child safety, family dynamics, and media responsibility. It has taught communities to look more carefully at the lives of children, to notice the details, and to value their stories beyond the shock of tragedy. Through the decades, JonBenét's story continues to spark reflection, prompting people to consider not only how we investigate and report crimes, but how we remember the lives behind them. The legacy of JonBenet Ramsey is subtle, yet enduring. It is found in the compassion of those who continue to learn from her story. It is present in the quiet remembrance of families who see in her the importance of cherishing children and the fragility of their world. It is in the careful, respectful storytelling that preserves her humanity above the mystery. Even as investigators revisit old evidence, as documentaries explore theories, and as new generations hear her story, JonBenet remains a child, not a symbol. She is remembered for her life, however brief, for her curiosity, for the laughter she shared with those who loved her. Each time her story is told gently, with care, it restores a sense of her humanity, softening the edges of a tragedy that otherwise could only haunt. When the city sleeps and the streets of Boulder are quiet, it is easy to imagine her presence. A little girl running softly through her home, twirling in the glow of Christmas lights, listening to the faint hum of music, whispering secrets to her brother, dreaming of the day's adventures. In these moments, she is alive in memory, vibrant, and cherished. No headlines, no speculation, no mystery can erase that image. JonBenet Ramsey's story teaches us that even in tragedy, there is space for tenderness, reflection, and quiet remembrance. We honor her by holding her life gently in our thoughts, by acknowledging her as a child first, and by remembering that behind every case, behind every mystery, there is a human being. So as the night falls, as lights dim and the world drifts towards sleep, we can hold JonBenet in a quiet, soft way. Remember her not for the questions that remain unanswered, not for the headlines that drew attention, but for the child she truly was, playful, curious, and deeply loved. And in that remembrance, she continues to shine, softly, gently, and eternally. JonBenet Ramsey's story is more than a mystery. It is a reminder of the fragile, fleeting nature of childhood and the importance of remembering the lives behind the headlines. She was a little girl with laughter, curiosity, and dreams. A child who loved music, dancing, stories, and the quiet warmth of her family's home. Even in tragedy, she remains a presence in memory, a gentle light that endures through decades. As we reflect on her life, we honor her by focusing on who she was, rather than the questions that surround her death. Each story we tell with care, each reflection on her life, preserves her humanity and reminds us to hold the lives of children softly, tenderly, and with respect. If this story brought you reflection, subscribe for more calm, gently narrated true crime tales designed for sleep. Stories that honor the lives behind the headlines, told slowly, thoughtfully, and with care. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember JonBenet not for the tragedy, but for the life she lived, the joy she carried, and the quiet, enduring light she leaves in the world.